Hi, good morning. This is the September 20th edition of the CEL open source meetings for SIG API machinery. My name's Joe. This is under CNCF guidelines, so just be kind to each other and considerate. We're going to go ahead and get started. So did anybody have any major agenda items they wanted to cover today?
Yeah, the one you were talking about.
If not, I was hoping to use this as a chance to go over the top unresolved issues in the CEP and list out the alternatives we have. My current plan is to try and merge the CEP as provisional today. I wanted to do it Friday. David Eads has promised me another review today, under the understanding that we're going to mark all unresolved topics with this flag, and we have to get these all cleared out before we can mark the CEP as implementable. So the idea is to allow us to actually merge and share a document instead of having me have just a PR open, because I think that doesn't actually facilitate some of the collaboration we want, because a lot of this is subdivisable work at this point. Anyways, so the one that me and CC were beginning to talk about at the beginning of this meeting was one of the main unresolved issues. This came up when we showed this CEP to API reviewers, was how do you define the configurations of a policy? And for background, the way that we've split things up is that you have a policy definition, which says, what the actual rules that you're going to enforce are in CEL. Then it has some other stanzas that talk about which objects it applies to and how you configure it, and which objects you use to configure it. Then somehow you have some objects that actually configure it. And you can think of, and actually OPA Gatekeeper and a couple other systems explicitly call this template. Maybe we will when we actually go to finalize the name. But you can think of this as being not something that it does anything by itself. If you put this in a Kubernetes API server as a client, you have no way to observe that it's there until you actually put a configuration in. And so, this would be one configuration of that says for the environment called test, the max replicas is 3. So this is a configuration of that policy. You can have multiple configurations of the policy. The question is, how do you go about mechanically defining these? And there's a couple alternatives. So the one that I'd originally proposed in this CEP was called duck typing. Well, that's what I'm calling it, because basically what you're doing is saying if something looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. Where what we're saying is if something has this match field in it and it's structured correctly, the API server can just inspect that and say, oh, these are match rules. I know what these are, and I know how to interpret them. And so I'm going to deserialize them into a structured format and then start processing them. But there's nothing about the CRD that forces you to structure this correctly, right? This is your CRD. You got to define the schema for it. You could have defined the schema not quite right, and there's a bunch of failure modes that can happen. So we've gotten pushback on that design. Another design that I proposed but didn't actually like very much, but I wanted to show it, was the idea of using a sub-resource. So you could have a match rules sub-resource, kind of like the scale sub-resource. And then when you define a CRD, if you say that it has match rules, you're now forced to structure them correctly, and that would be type checked for you. So it at least has the type checking in it, but it also has all of the overhead and complexity associated with defining a sub-resource, which has only been done a few times in Kubernetes in very special cases. And in CRDs, it's even a less paved road. So this is we're getting way out into the weeds of what the API server supports. I'm not sure the SIG is really interested in having a lot of sub-resources. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're not. So I feel like this would be an uphill battle, and plus it's not something I'm sure I want. I think Max, you pointed out, there's a bunch of other stuff related to being a sub-resource that we don't actually care about. And so this adds a lot of complexity to get only one thing. The other one I proposed, I don't love any of these, so I'm just kind of listing out everything I can think of, and if anybody can think of anything better, let me know, was to actually use 2 resources. And so I'll show what that might look like. So what you could do is you could have a Kubernetes built-in type called policy configuration. And this has the structured match rules, and it has a reference to another configuration object. Then your CRD, which you define, is completely freeform. You just say what the configuration of that is, which will only be consumed by the CEL expression that you write. So there's no duck typing going on here from like an API server perspective. The API server will never actually look at the contents of this directly. It'll pass it to CEL, but you wrote the CEL expression. So everything's in the extension, so to speak. So this kind of solves the problem of like keeping this structured at the cost of having two resources. So that was this third option, which I called policy configuration, kind of the config reference. There was two others that I was going to mention just briefly. This one I think is even less interesting. You basically have two resources. Well, you don't actually have two resources. Let me see if I can show an example. What you do is you try and embed the config using something called an embedded resource in Kubernetes. So you define a policy configuration type and it's structured, but the configuration is defined inline, but it's considered a separate group in kind. The problem with this is the API server will allow you to do stuff like this, but it doesn't inspect the contents of this at all. So it wouldn't, even if there was a CRD of this kind, it wouldn't go and check it for you. It wouldn't go type check it. If you deleted the CRD, it wouldn't realize the CRD had gotten deleted. This is literally just opaque data from the API server's perspective. You kind of put these hints here, but there's nothing else that goes on. We could try and teach the API server how to handle this. That would be a lot of complexity. We'd be repeating a lot of like the CRD support in Kubernetes to get this field to be like behaving like a CR. And there's some like really residual implications of this. So like, what if they do delete the CRD? Do we delete this whole thing? Do we not allow them to delete the CRD? Those life cycle choices that all have to be made. So that's that alternative. And then the final alternative is where we generate CRDs. This actually exists in some third-party systems. The approach is, I don't have an example here, but basically what you do is inside your policy definition, you just provide a schema for the parameterizable part of the config. And then a CRD is generated for you, and that CRD actually becomes a duct-typed CRD. You put the right fields in there, and then the API server is expected to understand them. So it's kind of a derivative of this approach. Did that make sense to everyone?
So the policy configuration. Oh, right, the embedded versus reference. That's the one without the type checking you were talking about versus having two resources.
Yeah,
right?
this one here is a reference. In fact, you might not even need the API inversion in kind because you already know what kind it is, but you would at least need the name. But this one references it, and then you define it all as a CRD. And then the embedded one, you literally just toss it straight in. So you actually have the contents here and the parameterizable field.
Gotcha. I have one like minor thought on one of them that I'm not sure anyone will like anymore. But if anyone had questions, I didn't want to stump on that. So with regard to the match rules sub-resource, one thing I was thinking is like sub-resources are very heavyweight, but you know, open API schema, or at least JSON schema, allows referencing schemas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't allow the same, yet it has a lot of these kind of patterns where they reuse the same object embedded in a lot of CRDs.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if it would be possible to extend the CRD definition such that rather than just a whole sub-resource, it's just a reference in the schema.
That's an interesting design. Yeah, that would solve the problem, because then what you would do is you would say that you would somehow register with the system the idea of a match rule, or maybe that's built in, and then you could reference it in the other schema, and then everybody knows what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I would love to take that to API machinery and or API reviewers and see if they would be interested in that.
Yeah, like I could see a lot of reasons why people wouldn't, right? Like if
Mhm.
you reference CRDs, in which case that would be kind of a mess. But if it's certain core embedded objects, which I don't know if Kate's is still going on this route of everything is a CRD, in which case this would like be backtracking on that a little bit. But
Yeah, I mean, the one nice thing about getting stuff like that into the design is we're reaching a point here where, like, if we can get every viable alternative listed and at least show people that we've thought about them and had a reason why we couldn't do them, then later when somebody comes like, why did you do it this way? Like, we actually have like the history and the justifications. It's not like, oh no, we didn't think about that. It's like, no, we did, and we talked to people, and here's the outcome. And so it could save the SIG a lot of time down the road from like having double jeopardy on some like these design decisions, which I think there's some value to. Like, we're so close now to having like listed out everything that we can think of. So I'll add that, and I will talk to the SIG leads briefly. I'll probably just do this on Slack and mention to some people and see if I can get some feedback on those alternatives. And then what we'll do is we'll merge this unresolved with all these listed, and we'll push one. I feel like this one here is my fallback if we can't do better right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not super thrilled with that alternative. I actually think you can make this work, but I feel like I haven't like gone through the mental effort of proving that it's safe. And I think Jordan's request on this one was like, if you can show all the failure modes and you can show you can handle them all, then maybe.
Yeah, the problem I have with the duck type one is just the upgrade story.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're coupling the shape of the match resource with the shape of the policy. It's problematic if you have a policy that's more recent than your Kate's cluster, in which case you might not be able to like adopt policy fixes, and it could be annoying if you have like policies from multiple different authors that have different match criteria, so you don't have that expectation of uniformity. The second one you can argue, well, yeah, but you gain the ability to mask out certain matching behaviors if they're dangerous for you or something.
And I think all the other designs do get you this. This would get it because if you upgraded policy configuration, you would just get new fields. If you got embedded working right, I think you would get the same. If you got matching rules right, you would get the same, I think. Maybe. You would still need a place to store the new fields. So this one actually might be kind of messy to upgrade. I don't know if you say I've got a CRD and I want to have a sub resource, and I want to add new subfields to it. You still need the base schema to include those somehow. So that this one actually might not be very good from an upgrade perspective either.
Like upgrading.
Yeah. Like if you said there's some new part of the match schema that I want to have, and when you upgrade, everybody starts getting it.
Everyone starts getting. Well, that's I thought a good thing, in the sense of like unless you like are conscious about not giving people the new thing because people want to like vet these changes and gate them. Is there any other reason why you wouldn't want to?
I think you would want to give it to them.
Okay.
And I think this you would get that property when you upgraded. You would get the new behavior. This one you would not. This one you would not, because the CRD has a schema, and you would have to change the schema. In fact, adding to a sub resource like this, like adding anything to the scale sub resource right now, I don't think there's a clear path on how you would go about like getting that out. This one, it depends if you implement it right. What your references approach would also work, right? Like you would, if there was a built-in type and you referenced it, then when you upgraded, the built-in type would now have the new field, and so everything would just work. So I think this and the built-in type are probably, this and the reference, the schema reference that you mentioned, I think would both work.
I'm curious, the sub-resource one, that doesn't seem like a logical necessity that you wouldn't automatically get the rules. It's just that pipeline hasn't been built.
Yeah, this kind of gets into the nitty gritty of the way that sub-resources work today for CRDs, and we could do better, but the way they work right now is you have to place all of your data in your main schema. So you have some main schema that includes everything, and then you can reference where things are in that schema. So if your scale sub-resource, you can say like, I think there's like 3 fields in a scale sub-resource or something, and you get to put a path to each of them when you define the scale sub-resource. You use JSON path. You say like, this field's here in the schema, this one's here in the schema, and this one's here in the schema. But if they're not in the schema, they're just not there. So that's the mechanism we have today. Arguably, if you could do better and say like, this part of the schema is a match, and my sub-resource, like, just either there's a well-defined place where it is or something else, then we could make this work, but we'd be adding machinery to do that.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But I mean, maybe we should list that out in more detail. So that at least gives us 3 alternatives. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll add the one that you mentioned, Max, and then we'll circulate that. And I think we've got a couple weeks to start to narrow this down to a solution. So we'll keep pounding on that one. The other ones that are still outstanding. Oh, I wanted to show this to everyone really briefly if people are interested. So we have to decide like what match support we're going to have. So I've listed out like what a bunch of other systems have in terms of match support. WH here is webhooks. So the standard webhooks have basically 4 main things, maybe a little more. You can use namespace selectors, which are pretty flexible. You can use object selectors, which are very specific. Like some built-in types allow you to select on certain fields, but that has to be baked in. You can select on the API group and resource and version. The version is interesting. I'll get back to that if anybody wants to know more. You can pick the scope, whether or not you're doing namespace or cluster scope. And then you can do the HTTP operation, like is this a create or an update or something like that. Actually, that's not truly HTTP operations because I'd be put in post, but you get the idea. The one main one that we wanted to add was exclusion support. So you could say like, but not this. Then we also had some requests to support auth-z type information, which was like user group and permission access, RBAC permissions, which are also called verbs. So I kind of try to make that clear. Those are the main ones we're planning to support. These 2, this one I don't think applies to us. There's like, if you want to like actually like list out the what are some examples of a non-resource URL? Like /swagger will get you like the open API schema. There are other endpoints on the API server that get you like health information, things like that. So right now we're not supporting webhooks on those. The webhook chain isn't even connected to them, so that would be a major change to the system. And this one I won't talk about yet because I'm not sure if we're gonna do it. So anyways, we have a bunch of things that we can match on. It's not really clear what the best mechanism is to do this. I could probably use some help thinking about this more. If anybody is interested in this topic, I think it's a good one to subdivide. Right now, I have mostly just kind of looked at prior art and replicated it, but I think there is more thinking that could happen here. The way that most of the Kubernetes built-in types work is that you define kind of a list of match criteria, and each match criteria, if it matches, then the whole thing is considered a match. And you kind of go down the list. So you start at the top, you're like, well, does this match criteria match? Okay, no. Okay, I'll check the next one. Does this one match? If yes, then I'm good. Audit has another thing called a level, where if the level is none, then the effect is to basically consider it not a match and then stop. So you at the very top, if you want to like exclude all pods from your matching rules, you can set a special rule at the top that doesn't exclude, and then none of the rules below apply. It's a little bit of a weird thing to reason through.
Sorry, I'm a little lost on what you said, because it doesn't actually sound special, right? Like, so what I heard was if all match criteria, for every defined match criteria, I should say, because undefined is also like something to consider.
Yeah.
If a defined match criteria, every defined match criteria must be satisfied in order to match, right?
That's not the way that these systems work in the built-in types. What they do is if any one of them matches, it short circuits and considers it a match. It's an or. Logically, if you think about it, it's an or. It's like, if this one matches, okay, I'm good. No, if this one matches, okay, I'm good. So that's basically the default predicate is an or on all the Kubernetes built-in types. So you can, if you think of an Venn diagram, you're just overlaying circles and just adding to the match set.
Gotcha. I would suggest not that.
That's what we want to try and do better than. I like to think about this more like an SQL where clause, where you can have and, or, and not, you know, like where you can have like, you can really define what your matching criteria is logically, kind of with Boolean logic. That's kind of how I like to think about it. And I feel like when I look at the way that most of these systems work, I'm trying to like look at what is written and the system that processes it and try and like reframe it in my mind as that. It gets a lot messier when you add exclude rules.
If you have like ands and ors, like having that definitely like makes things messy. If you just have, sorry, my cat. Hi, Mac. If you just have excludes, if you just have ands and you have an exclude rule, then it just becomes like another rule in the chain that needs to be satisfied. Same thing with like the nots. Yeah, the difficulty with ors is you start needing to worry about potentially like prioritization, right?
Yeah, if you don't have excludes, then you just have a list of any of the things matched, and if any of them match, regardless of order, you're going to catch it, right? But once you add an exclude to it, will short circuit the whole thing.
Wait, no, if you have an X, okay, so if it's just ANDed, right, it anything can short circuit anything, right?
But we're doing ors right now, so it goes through, and if any one of them matches, then it's going to.
Okay, so do we need to do ors? Like, what's the?
Well, I think a lot of the cases are like, I want to match pods or replica sets or deployments.
Okay, so that's intra. That seems like intra match requirement, right? Like you within kind, you want an or, but you would want to say, I want to match all pods and they need to be in the production namespace,
yeah,
or something like that. So in Gatekeeper, just so you know, the template I'm thinking through, the match schema, the way we've defined it, the high level match schema, each individual field needs to be satisfied so that it's an and at that level. But every subfield is free to define its own logic within that, with the caveat that undefined always matches.
Yeah. So one clarification. So you have a list of match criteria like this. So that each one of these is basically the element in the list. And the list is ORed, but each individual one, I think it's an and. So if you just write one match criteria, you can say it has to have this namespace and it has to have this user permission. So it's kind of like an implicit, you and all together all of the items within one list element, and then you or together the various list elements. So it's kind of like based on where you are on the levels of this stanza in YAML, you get different anding and oring, and it's supposed to be intuitive.
I got you. So like it's a list of match criteria within a single element of that list.
Yeah.
It's operating kind of like how I was saying.
Yeah. So I think maybe OPA Gatekeeper does kind of everything as like one match criteria, maybe. Yeah. And here you can just have a list of them that you're ORed, or any one of them can be an exclusion. And if it's at the top, then you short circuit.
Okay, and so wait, when you're talking about exclusion now, you're talking about a match criteria can be treated as an exclusion.
Yeah, so a whole one of these can be marked with this whole thing is an exclude. So if you match it, you invert, and you consider everything to not match, and then you short circuit out. Right, like it gets a little wacky. So I feel like this is not entirely baked. Audit does this, and I guess I don't know how people feel about it. I've never written an audit rule, so I don't know where we are. Webhooks are simpler because there's no excludes, so you just have a list of these things, but you only have like 3 or 4 things, and the selectors are pretty powerful on their own because they have like within these, there's kind of some subset of Boolean logic.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about the exclude, I do wonder, is it just denormalized, right? Like, is there anything you couldn't express by also just updating the match criteria for all the non-excludes?
Well, this one already has a not in. So this one already has an exclude built in, and I think this one might too. So maybe the answer,
selector,
maybe the answer, it's kind of weird to have an exclude and have these, to be perfectly honest, because these already kind of like have their own built-in exclude. But it's a little different because when these ones don't match, then you just keep going down the list. But when you do an exclude, you're saying like, I've decided that because this thing matches my match rule, I'm going to short circuit and say this is not a match for my entire admission control object.
I suppose if we focused on user, I can kind of make this make a little more sense, right? Like all users must do this unless you're an admin and it's break glass time.
Yeah.
Although, like at that point, you could just add a secondary match criteria, user star, right? Or undefined selects all user, and then user, the negated user, like accept users, I guess.
Yeah.
But you would need to add it to all match criteria.
Yeah, you would have to add that to all. So yeah, I think a lot of things become possible in these schemes before everything becomes convenient, which I think is a little bit of the trick. But yeah, I think this needs work. I don't feel like it's there yet. I haven't given it enough time and love, which is, I think, part of the problem. I think, yeah, I think we could use some help. Max, if you're interested in taking a stab at this, go for it. I would love to see, even if you just like look at what exists today, just kind of like the smattering of support across these things by different systems. It feels like, I don't know, it feels really messy to me when I looked at them all and saw all the different kinds of things that were supported and partially supported, and some things were better than others. So I think if we did a really good job on matching here, it would probably be something we'd want to start trying to like proliferate into the API server and other places. I mean,
is it going?
It feels like we're like now the 4th or I think 5th system that's trying to do this better.
Yeah. I have another match type for you, by the way. The annotations. Customize can match on annotations. but only like exact string matching.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to list. Where is there label selectors? I feel like,
That was object selectors, I thought. So I was a bit confused when you said it was specific. Because you're right. Like there's kubectl also can interrogate fields. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I should probably break that out here to make it really clear, because there are maybe I should have written label selectors here and object selectors are not supported. I'll double check that. Label selectors I think are more straightforward. Object selectors are very strange in Kubernetes.
Yeah, in the admission webhooks, the field is object selector. So I don't know, maybe looked at the list, used two definitions.
I'll double check that and clarify.
Anyway, I'm happy to think about this stuff. I guess I would like to know a little bit more. Do we have any information on the use cases for exclusion?
I think, yeah, we should probably list some out. There is a issue open against Kubernetes for the lack of exclusion for webhooks. So I'll link. Did I?
Oh, that was me.
That was you. I think. There you go. I think there are. Let me see if I can dig up some others. I know it comes up. I know it is like the answer we've been giving people is like list out everything except for the one that you wanted to exclude, which is unfortunately intractable because it's not future-proofed against the addition of, like, if you're matching against kinds, like listing out all the kinds, first of all, is kind of silly because it's a really long list. And then if some new kind gets added later, then it accidentally gets excluded because like you didn't list it, but you were trying to do an inverted list. So you were actually trying to exclude very specific things, and like you didn't want something to accidentally get added. So I think that's one of the cases. It's worse for some things than others, right? It's worse for like namespaces where like, I know I want to exclude kube system, but I wanted to include all the other namespaces. Or it's really bad for resource kinds because like that's kind of an open set as well. It's actually fine not to have excludes for like things like scope or operation because the set is so small that you can just invert it by hand and it's safe.
Okay, yeah, so this is almost more about expressibility at all rather than like convenience of design. There's not.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And I think if you broke it down, you could actually identify the places where the exclude is very specifically needed. I mean, if I mentioned namespaces, but there's already a not in there, so you can already invert this. But you couldn't invert all of the resources. You couldn't say like the resource is not.
I think kube system is a good example, though. Like namespace selectors are really label selectors on the namespace, right? And so the challenge with excluding kube system is, well, now I need to label kube system. And that's not necessarily like in a shared ownership, like Gatekeeper, for example, right? I'm not gonna like put a kube system namespace in the manifest. So then that puts it on the user to do their own labeling to exclude.
Yeah, any third-party system, you're going to have to assume that you don't have access to go start throwing labels on special things and stuff like that.
Right. Well, and also label selectors have a permissions thing. Like the other side of it is even namespace selectors, you potentially want a second webhook because you don't that ACLs the labels because you don't necessarily want the ability to create namespaces to be equivalent to the ability to bypass policy. So namespace selectors selecting by specifically name could be good, as well as label. Like I'm not saying label isn't useful, but yeah, there's room for more. So maybe not also take these at face value in terms of what we're speaking against.
Yeah. The only other, I think, things to watch for on this one is Where it is not a problem, we want to bias slightly towards consistency across the APIs. So for example, like webhooks already use this and the rule to some degree. So if they are compatible, we should bias a little bit towards keeping them, but we shouldn't be limiting ourselves too much by that. So it's kind of a judgment call on like where we decide to diverge from the things that are already there.
Well, we can augment too, like namespace selector, fine, and then namespaces, right?
Yeah, in fact, you even see that a little bit, like rule with operations. I think rule was defined outside of admission control, and so they supplemented that with an operations thing and created a new type. We could take that even further, right? We could have something else like that, but you can see like rule was pulled in as an attempt to kind of like share types across the system. Okay, so that one, thank you, Max. That's really helpful. I'll make a couple notes there and then we'll have that as provisional. Those are the biggest ones. There is a bunch of smaller ones that I don't want to ignore, but there's a bunch of questions around how we represent enforcement and how we delegate enforcement to the configurations. I've written a couple notes there, but this one is, I consider incomplete. There's like a bunch of unresolveds around this, if anybody gets time. Type safety, one thing I wanted to mention was that we are moving to dynamic type checking. So like most type checking will happen at runtime against the real content. There is a slew of reasons that we found we had to do this. I was the one advocating for type safety and just couldn't get the use cases to fit. So if anybody's interested, I tried to summarize that. I am going to aspirationally try and get some informational type checking going. That's actually pretty hard, but maybe useful to people. So I'm going to keep pushing on that. But right now, we're just going to do dynamic is going to be what's happening at runtime. I think those are the main ones. This one I think is still a little contentious, whether or not we support that in the first phase or whether or not we think about it more and support it. So anybody has thoughts on this one? I actually will put an unresolved on this one. I forgot. So I don't think this is in stone yet. And then there's a bunch of stuff. In fact, I'll just go to the top to kind of show like what the breakdown is. Right now, what we're thinking about in terms of phasing is to get the core functionality in, which is focused pretty much on those two things we spent almost all today talking about, plus how we represent violations, and then some things like safety measures and failure policies. This may go into phase 2 unless we get people really supporting it. And what that does is it leaves a ton of things in phase 2. If we're going to do like namescape scoped policies support, that would be in there. Any idea around like scoping of expressions, like you say, like I want this expression to be like the CEL won't actually be given the root of the object, it'll be given like some field. Secondary auth, this idea of having default configurations for like this one is interesting. We should talk about that at some point. Access to namespace metadata, transition rules, which is access to the old object. More around like aggregated API servers and something. So there's a ton of stuff that I'm pushing out here. I would say we're getting close enough to cap freeze that our time is probably.
I already had my thanks.
What's that?
Actually, I got to active.
Sorry, Jared. Were you trying to say something?
Oh, sorry. I forgot to mute.
All good. So what I was going to say is I think our time is probably best spent mostly focusing here and focusing on like whether or not these things are in the right buckets. So if anybody wants to advocate that something should go into phase 1, now's a good time. Or if something should not go into phase 1, now's a good time. I think this is starting to get close to something that like with a good set of people we could implement in one release.
I with regard to like phase 2, phase 1, like for instance, if singleton policies moves to phase 2, we probably want to make sure we at least leave room for it in phase 1 when we're talking about like reporting violations, right?
Yeah.
Like if we're tracing back to the resource that caused the violation so that people can debug. That's the reporting is going to look different for a singleton resource.
Yes, it will. Absolutely, because you won't have a configuration to talk about. Yeah, so that one, if we do move it out, we're gonna have to be really careful. Some of these, I feel like this one is probably intertwined too, but I think it's still a real question whether or not we're gonna do it. I feel like transition rules can kind of be added on. Namespace split up quality configuration can probably be added on. Expression scoping can probably be added on.
I mean, that's the part of the CEP we haven't even touched, right? Which is what is CEL, how is CEL structured in these things?
Yeah, in fact, I think that is under described in the CEP right now. I did try and make some notes. Where did I put it? Oh yeah. There is a section, I think it's under like policy definition or something. Let me see if I can find it just so people know where it is. Okay, so that's the example. Oh, I don't even have it listed. I do somewhere have some notes on basically what variables you're going to have access to in CEL. Let me get that added on so that everybody can see that. I think that's a pretty major decision, actually, that we kind of like neglected because we were so worried about some other things. But I think under the main section about policy definitions, we need to have a thing here. It says like, here are all the variables you have access into CEL. Here's what they can do. Some notes about like which functions you have access to and some stuff like that. We're going to be mostly picking back off of the CRD validation work where we added a bunch of functions. But I think we still need to do an audit of those and say like what is missing that we want to add. One example that came up to kind of get people thinking about that is right now in CEL, you cannot access the current time. So if you wanted to say, I want to write a policy that says you can't make changes on the weekend to something, right now it would be impossible to do that. Which might be good because that is a nice constraint that allows you to shift policies left. But if somebody wanted that, you wouldn't be able to do it.
Like a missing function, I think, is whatever. Like adding new things is always going to be backwards compatible. My concern would be around like if we just do like rule violation severity or whatever. That well, one, putting the violation severity. Oh, I think this is an objection. I think I commented on this, but if we put the violation severity embedded in the policy, we kind of take away from the user who's writing the specific violations the ability to define that, right? Which could be useful, particularly like gradual rollout of new policies, right? You want everything to be worn, or if you have different environments, like staging, let people do it, but warn them it won't work. Anyways, got distracted.
Yeah, that I think is a really good concern. I haven't figured out how to think about that yet. So the thoughts I had were, you're going to have a list of validations. If you do allow you to say like warn or deny there, do you do it on a per expression basis or you do it for the whole policy? If you do allow this, then can you override that on the per configuration basis? So like, could you have like a configuration that says, I match these things, I'm configured this way, but I want to set the enforcement level to ignore. If you do this, this is nice from a config. Maybe the answer is, I would love to hear arguments on this. Maybe the answer is you only configure it here, but you're required to put a setting.
I would tend toward that for a couple of reasons. Like one, I think it does like change for the abstract policies, kind of the granularity in which they're written, right? because then, yeah, people do need to write these things such that you can ignore, warn, violate. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Okay.
Though it does lead to more resources. But simplifies the internal syntax a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of this too is, and maybe I'm overthinking this because audit and shift left aren't really our goal here, but different points of enforcement have different types of enforcement available to them potentially.
Right.
And also, you may want to have different severity, right? Like in a shift left world, probably you want to be more severe shift left because fail fast, and also you don't want to break prod. So being a little softer in prods when something's new.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And so I'm not sure how to reflect that here. I think I know that Kubernetes for webhooks had these three concepts. So deny, of course, it had. Warning, it has, which means it basically is going to log some information, and it has a channel back to the clients to give warning information, even with the 200 OK. Then there's this idea of like record an audit event, which puts it into the Kubernetes audit log, but you also have to provide an audit key if you have this setting. So the enforcement in that case is like you set an enforcement level, and then you would also require to have like an audit key field. Maybe it's not clear to me if audit should be an enforcement level or if it should be on the side. I would be very interested in people's thoughts on this. So if it, the way that webhook work is you're allowed to return three different things. You can return basically yes, no, like an allow or deny. You can return any number of warnings, and you can return any number of audit keys. So if we were to replicate that behavior, then what we would do is you could say like you could have different, in the policy, you could have different levels of things. You could have warns, you could have audits, and you could have maybe more than one deny, because I think we can like basically sum up those errors. Or we don't do this at all, right? Like you just have a bunch of expressions, and then if they fail, then you would just say in the configuration where they get logged. It's a little weird in this case because I'm not sure what you would do if you needed multiple audit keys. I haven't figured that one out yet.
Multiple audit keys per violation, you're saying, or
well, if you had multiple expressions that failed, and you were reporting them in audit, would you just collapse all of them into? I mean, would you report each one independently? I'm not quite sure what to do there.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to like if you have like 5 different webhooks that all fail for a given request, is that 5 different audit events anyway? If you're logging.
Yeah, you can kind of do end-to-end there. So you could have one webhook that just reports one audit if you want, and then so what it will do is it will return in its response like an audit annotation section, and it would just have like one audit key and value. And so 5 webhooks did that. They could each return 1, or you could have one webhook that returns 5 audit annotations, each with a key and value. I don't know. We don't have to model things like webhooks because we're not a webhook, but if we're going to have multiple expressions, we'd have to figure out how to support that, which is a little messier than the other ones.
And we have multiple rules too, right? Like maybe the easiest thing in terms of like guaranteeing consistency is reporting them separately, because if we have multiple rules, either we then need to like glob all of those together as well, or you're gonna get sort of weird, lumpy granularities if people are defining like multi-part policies for a single logical policy. if that makes sense. Yeah, so that, I mean, you could do something around like special keys, but then also you probably want to have admin defined keys, right? Like what compliance regimes is this like intended toward, right? If these are audit keys that you're looking to like retroactively pull up, right? You probably want the abstract intent associated with that rather than the specific policy kind.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I kind of agree with that. I feel like if you are going to have audit keys, they kind of belong in the policy so that they're standard. Like asking people to like figure that out on individual configurations is a little weird. But I can imagine also that you would want the ability to like basically set this to be a fail rule or set this to be ignored or something else. So
I mean, there's nothing that says all of these things need to be defined next to each other either, right?
No.
Like you could have an audit key, and then if users decide to audit, that audit key would be used, or it could be ignored. I almost think enforcement action is more than just a single string, right? Like it's tempting to make it a single string. I think if you have multi enforcement point, which I'm not convinced is in scope for this, you definitely want it to be a list and have some kind of targeting. Even if it's not, though, the ability for users to add extra context, right? Or maybe some sort of like matching. Like you could imagine if you wanted to have some kind of metadata associated with these validations, right? Users could then choose different enforcement actions depending on the categories of stuff that was violated.
Yeah, I would be very interested in somebody in like an idea of like somehow you kind of identify or catalog these in the policy, and then that gives you enough information. So over in the configuration, you can say everything you want to say about your enforcement.
Yeah. Which, if we wanted to preserve the ability to do that, that turns enforcement action into at least an object, maybe a list of objects.
Yeah.
But if we don't wind up doing anything with it, then it's sort of an annoying vestigial.
Yeah.
Why am I typing extra characters here?
Yeah. All right. Well, we are, I think, at time, but thank you all so much, especially, Max, thank you for your feedback. I think this one could use some more alternatives listed out. So hopefully once it merges, I would be very interested in anybody that wants to contribute ideas here. I will try and generate some alternatives on this one too. I think that gives us at least 3 major items to look over. I think, Cece, do you remember when the deadline is? I feel like it's the beginning of October, like 7 or 6 or something like that.
6.
All right.
October 6.
That gives us probably a week and a half, 2 weeks before we need to get this in for final review. Anyways, I will send it out when the CEP merges and invite people to kind of start pounding on these individual topics, and we'll see how far we can get. I will close it out here since we're at time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.